A 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck the Philippines this morning, killing at least 19 people, and a tsunami warning was issued across Asia. Morgan Stanley told investors this week that SpaceX will generate $3.4 trillion in revenue by 2040, and Zelensky met with 3 European heads of government at 10 Downing Street last night to push for direct peace talks with Russia, the same Russia that fired Oreshnik hypersonic missiles at Ukrainian nuclear infrastructure over the weekend. None of these 3 stories is straightforward. Let me take them apart. Start with the Philippines, because this deserves more than a disaster brief. At 7:40 this morning local time, an offshore magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck south of General Santos, a city of 722,000 people in the Sorsogon region of southern Mindanao. At least 19 people are confirmed dead and more than 200 injured, with casualties still being counted. A few buildings partially collapsed in General Santos, including a shopping center where a Jollibee restaurant, a fast food chain that is among the most recognizable institutions in Filipino daily life, was reduced to rubble. St. Elizabeth Hospital sustained severe structural damage, forcing patients and medical personnel to evacuate and begin treating patients outside the main building. A key access bridge sustained dangerous cracks and was closed. Video verified by AFP showed a school structure collapsing in Malita, Davao Occidental Province. A 1-meter tsunami was recorded at nearby coasts. Smaller waves reached Indonesia, Palau, and southern Japan before the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center lifted the major threat. The aftershocks continued for over an hour, with the largest measuring 6.5 on the Richter scale. This is the second major seismic event in the Philippines in days. This followed a magnitude 6.9 earthquake that killed 76 people and destroyed or damaged 72,000 buildings in Cebu Province in central Philippines just days earlier. 2 earthquakes above 6.5, both causing significant casualties and structural destruction. The Philippines sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most seismically active zones on the planet. This is known. It has been known for centuries. The islands experience approximately 20 significant earthquakes per year. And yet, when the 7.8 hit General Santos this morning, school buildings collapsed on camera in Malita. Children were photographed reacting to a canopy roof coming down around them during class. A hospital in a city of 722,000 was damaged so severely that it could not function inside its own walls. I want to make an argument here that the coverage tends to avoid. Natural disasters are not random acts of equal destruction. They are interactions between a natural event and the quality of the built environment that meets it. A 7.8 magnitude earthquake hits a well-constructed city differently than it hits a poorly constructed one. Japan sits on the same ring of fire. Tokyo experiences significant earthquakes regularly. Tokyo does not produce images of shopping center rubble and school buildings collapsing on camera the morning of because Japan has spent decades and enormous resources engineering its built environment to meet its seismic reality. The question of why requires honesty about structural poverty, about decades of inadequate infrastructure investment, about building codes that exist in law but not always in practice, and about the corruption in construction permitting that is documented and persistent. A Jollibee restaurant reduced to rubble in General Santos this morning is not a story about the earthquake. It is a story about the building that should have survived the earthquake and didn't. That story has a political and economic history longer than this particular seismic event, and it will produce more casualties the next time, and there will be a next time, unless that history is addressed. Now SpaceX, because today is a critical day and a new fact deserves full examination. Book building for the SpaceX IPO is now underway, today through Wednesday. Goldman Sachs and the 21-bank underwriting syndicate are collecting institutional orders for 555.6 million shares at $135 each. The deal is already oversubscribed. Bloomberg, citing people familiar with the matter, reported that demand has exceeded $150 billion, double the $75 billion available. Pricing is Thursday, June 11th. Trading begins Friday, June 12th. That demand figure requires calibration. Oversubscribed is the most used word in IPO marketing and the least informative. In any significantly oversubscribed offering, many institutions enter orders larger than they expect to receive, knowing allocation will be cut. An order book showing $150 billion for a $75 billion offering does not mean $150 billion of buyers are willing to hold the stock at $135. It means institutions placed $150 billion in orders, knowing they might get half, a third, or a tenth of what they asked for. The final clearing price, what actually happens to SPCX on June 12th at 9:30 a.m., is determined by the buyers who hold, not by the order book size. Morgan Stanley released a research note during the roadshow booking window projecting that SpaceX could generate $3.4 trillion in revenue and $2.7 trillion in adjusted EBITDA by 2040. Morgan Stanley is one of the 5 lead underwriters on this deal, alongside Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Citigroup. It is being paid a fee based on the size of the offering. The note requires SpaceX to grow revenues from approximately $18.7 billion in 2025 to $3 trillion, $4 trillion by 2040, an increase of roughly 181 times in 14 years. For context, Apple, the most profitable technology company in history, generates approximately $400 billion in annual revenue today after 47 years of public market operation. Microsoft generates approximately $245 billion. Alphabet, Google's parent, generates approximately $350 billion. Morgan Stanley is telling investors that SpaceX will, within 14 years, generate revenue roughly equal to the combined revenues of Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon, a figure none of those companies individually approached after decades of compounding growth. Fortune noted this week that SpaceX is breaking the IPO playbook with the fixed price structure, going straight to $135 per share, rather than running the traditional price discovery process. Wedbush analyst Dan Ives described it as very unconventional and said it would be seen simultaneously as a sign of confidence and a head-scratcher. The absence of price discovery is relevant to retail investors specifically, when there is no public process of narrowing from a range to a price. The signal that normally tells you whether institutional demand validated the number or pushed below it doesn't exist. You get a number. The number is $135. I'm not making the argument that SpaceX is a bad company or that $135 is too high. Starlink is real. The launch monopoly is real. The AI integration with xAI adds a genuine growth optionality. The question is whether any of that justifies a Morgan Stanley analyst publishing a $3.4 trillion revenue forecast during the booking window for an offering his firm is being paid to underwrite as analysis. The answer is that it doesn't. It is demand management dressed as research. The institutional investors receiving that note know this. The retail investors on Robinhood submitting IOIs this week may not. That is the asymmetry worth naming on June 8th, with pricing 4 days away. And now Ukraine. Because the story that happened at 10 Downing Street last night is significant, and the context around it is darker than the diplomatic photography suggests. On Sunday evening, Zelensky met Starmer, Macron, and Merz, the leaders of the UK, France, and Germany, at 10 Downing Street for a working session on Ukraine's military needs and the diplomatic path forward. The joint statement they issued backed direct dialogue between Ukraine and Russia with active US and European participation to bring about a ceasefire, and called for an immediate and complete ceasefire using the current line of contact as a starting point for negotiations. The leaders also discussed, per The Guardian, the urgent need to scale up the production of interceptors and co-develop anti-ballistic missile and deep strike capabilities. The EU's €90 billion loan package to Ukraine is now ready to deploy. Zelensky had written an open letter to Putin ahead of the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the forum where Ukrainian drones filled the sky with smoke last week, proposing direct talks. Putin's response, per Euronews, was to describe the letter as rude, question Zelensky's intentions, and say there was no point in a meeting. A Kremlin spokesperson suggested Zelensky was free to travel to Moscow if he wished to hold discussions. That invitation was made by a government that has been trying to destroy Zelensky's capital with missiles for 4 years. On Saturday and Sunday, Russia fired Oreshnik hypersonic ballistic missiles at Ukraine. Zelensky accused Russia of targeting critical nuclear infrastructure. A Ukrainian drone struck a passenger train in Crimea on Monday morning, killing the driver, according to the Moscow-installed regional head. The counter-exchange is continuing through the diplomatic weekend. The irony at the center of this week is worth stating explicitly. Russia is deploying hypersonic weapons capable of carrying nuclear warheads against Ukrainian nuclear facilities. Simultaneously, Russia's close partner Iran is being asked, in negotiations with the United States, to halt its nuclear program, to make verbal commitments not to pursue nuclear weapons. The world's primary nuclear state, the one that invaded a country and has been firing nuclear-capable missiles at it for over 4 years, is not being asked to make any such commitment. The asymmetry of nuclear accountability in the current global diplomatic framework is on full display. Iran is asked for verbal disarmament pledges, while Russia fires Oreshnik at nuclear sites, and nobody at Downing Street or in Washington mentions the connection. The picture is actually more favorable for Ukraine than the missile headlines suggest. Ukraine recaptured more territory than it lost to Russian forces in May for the second consecutive month. That is a meaningful operational shift, is more substantial financial commitment than anything the U.S. Congress has passed this year. European defense production is accelerating. The coalition at Downing Street last night represents genuine strategic depth. 3 of the 5 largest European economies aligned and armed. What it does not represent is a mechanism for forcing Russia to the table. Putin rejected the open letter. He rejected the format. He rejected the premise that there is anything to discuss at this stage. The Downing Street statement calls for what Europe wants. It does not compel what Russia does. The gap between European diplomatic preference and Russian operational reality remains exactly what it was before Zelensky landed in London. Without the United States actively inserting itself into the Ukraine process, not just Iran, the European coalition is a moral anchor without an enforcement chain. Trump has been focused on Iran for 3 months. Ukraine has been running on European support and Ukrainian resilience. Both of those are real. Neither of them is a peace negotiation. And Putin's response to an open letter was to call it rude and fire more missiles. A natural disaster exposing a built environment that was never adequately prepared for the tectonic reality it sits on. A financial offering whose analyst support is being produced by the banks being paid to underwrite it. And a diplomatic push for peace in Ukraine that has the right words and no mechanism to make Russia listen. The thread is not cynicism. It's something more specific. All 3 of these situations involve a gap between the institutional response and the structural problem underneath it. The Philippines responds to earthquakes. It has not rebuilt the buildings that fail in earthquakes. The IPO markets respond to demand. They have not disclosed that the demand manufacturing is done by the same institutions creating the demand signal. European diplomacy responds to Ukraine's needs. It has not produced a lever that moves Russia. Institutional responses without structural solutions produce the same outcome at slightly different intervals. The next earthquake, the next lockup expiry, the next round of missiles.